Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Thanks for watching. In this video I want to spend some time talking about famine relief. In particular, what I want to do is take some time to look at a line of argument or a set of arguments for the thesis that our obligations to famine relief are not that significant if we have them at all. So I've talked a bit about famine relief in other videos. I've talked about Peter Singer's famous solution to the problem of world poverty, where he argues, roughly speaking, that we are obligated to help save as many absolutely impoverished people's lives as possible. And what that amounts to is essentially giving up everything but our basic needs in order to help save those who are absolutely impoverished, given the significance of the need in question, given that there are hundreds of millions of people who are currently absolutely impoverished, living under $1.25 a day when the appropriate economic calculations are made in places in the world like sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia. We've also looked at a response to Singer by John Arthur. John Arthur argues that Peter Singer doesn't properly respect the significance of our moral entitlements, those things that we have a just claim to, our resources. And what Arthur wants to argue against Singer is that we have a right to our resources, a right to our belongings. And if that's true, then Singer's just wrong when he claims that we're obligated to give up these things we have a right to other people, even if they are absolutely impoverished, and even if they are, then such that their lives are really looking like they're imminent, meaning that death is imminent for the absolutely impoverished. So even given these severe kinds of circumstances, Arthur would argue that we have a right to our things, a right to the things that are justly ours. So that Arthur type response to Singer, his view, Arthur's view of famine relief, is one that's going to appeal to people having a just claim, a rightful claim to their resources. Now, another philosopher who's written quite a bit on famine relief is named Jan Narveson. And Narveson, he agrees with Arthur that Singer's wrong about what our obligations are to famine relief. In the piece that I'm going to be talking about in this video, Narveson doesn't directly go after Peter Singer, but what he does say does challenge Peter Singer's ideas. So what does Narveson argue? Well, maybe if we think about Narveson from an abstract perspective or a big picture perspective, we'll have a sense of where he fits in thinking about the famine relief issues and debates. So he thinks that when we think about the issue of justice and what justice requires of us when it comes to helping to save the absolutely impoverished, he thinks that we need to think about what justice commits us to, what it is that justice implies for us in terms of what our duties are. And what Narveson argues is that justice requires of us dominantly that we do not interfere with other people. So dominantly, justice is about principles, if you will, of non-interference or duties of non-interference. And of course, corresponding to these duties, in many cases, you're going to find that people have rights to not be interfered with. So generally speaking, when it comes to famine relief, people have an obligation not to interfere with those who are absolutely impoverished from getting the resources that they need. Likewise, the absolutely impoverished have a right to not be interfered with in their endeavor to meet their basic needs. So we recall, I just want to make sure we're clear on this, we recall that someone's absolutely impoverished when they're impoverished in such a way that they lack the resources to meet their basic needs. Those who are absolutely impoverished have a right to try to secure those resources to keep themselves alive. If you lack the resources to meet your basic needs, then death is imminent. So that's one feature. That's one main feature, perhaps the main feature of justice, according to Narveson. Again, it's the idea that we have general principles or duties of non-interference. But secondarily, we have general duties to do positive things for others. So they're positive duties that we have um, to do things for those whom we've wronged, or to right the wrongs that we are in some sense responsible for. So we have, in other words, duties, positive duties of reparations. So we have positive duties on this account um, when we've when we have to repair the wrongs that we've caused, or right the wrongs that we've caused. So those are the two sides of justice dominantly for Narveson. Again, non-interference, duties of non-interference corresponding to rights of, again, rights of non-interference, and then we have um, positive duties to repair the wrongs that we are responsible for causing. And so when we think about famine relief, argues Narveson, we don't have a stringent duty to provide anything positive to those who are absolutely impoverished, for example, because we just, in many cases, aren't responsible for the famine relief that's in question. Now, if it turned out that we were responsible for the famine relief in question, then we do have a responsibility to repair the wrong that we've caused that led to people being absolutely impoverished in the first place. But Narveson is going to argue that, by and large, the cause of famine relief has nothing to do with what individuals are doing in affluent countries, but rather with political issues. And he doesn't go into much detail on this in the paper Feeding the Hungry that I'm using to discuss his view in this video, but he does think that the issue is dominantly a political one, not primarily an agricultural one, or not primarily one that's caused by those who are in affluent nations, like the United States and other Western countries, just for example. Of course, there are other affluent countries in the East. So Narveson, he uses his conception of justice to try to establish his general stance when it comes to duties involving famine relief, and he's going to end up saying that we don't have a very stringent duty to give any of our resources to those who are absolutely impoverished. And so I want to look at a couple passages that go into a bit more detail on his view. So here's a passage that we get that does help paint a more detailed picture of his view. So he says this: the liberty proponent. So here we're talking about someone who really thinks that people have a fundamental right to their resources. The liberty proponent will thus insist that when Beethoven wrote symphonies instead of using his talents to grow food for the starving, like the peasants he depicted in his symphonies, he was doing exactly what he had a perfect right to do. A connoisseur of music might go further and hold that he was doing the right thing, doing what he was obligated to do, in other words. That someone with the talents of a Beethoven does more for people by composing great music than by trying to save lives, even if he would have been successful in saving those lives, which is not very likely anyways, he argues, but that's just sort of a side point. You see, so there's kind of argument here, which is that someone like a Beethoven has a perfect right to bring about the goods that he wants. I mean, he's born with a certain kind of talent for music, and he should have a right to pursue those talents instead of taking up the project of trying to feed those who are starving. So you see, the interesting kind of point here is that there may be different conceptions of what the good life is. So one conception of the good life is one that involves going out and helping the starving. Another one involves making great music. And of course, there could be others. The example that Narveson uses here could be one that is, you could say, multipliable. We can think about cases that are just like it. So someone who is gifted at some kind of athletic endeavor, or someone who is particularly intellectually inclined, can do philosophy, or could write literature, or could do something scientific, and those would be perfectly legitimate forms of life, and maybe examples of good lives. So while it may well be good to help save the starving, there are other conceptions of the good life that one could follow up on. and be perfectly within their rights in doing so. They'd be perfectly permissible for them to do so. And he goes on to say that it may even be obligatory in the case of Beethoven to make the music, because he does more good by making good music for the world than he would trying to save the starving. So here you can imagine, like, there's a kind of utilitarian conception here. Like, we can imagine that Beethoven's music is the kind of thing that promotes more good in the long run than the alternative option for him, which would be to help try to save the starving. Well, that can be true in our lives as well. It could be true that many of us are such that we could produce more good for the world following our conceptions of the good life, and not by taking up the onerous burden of trying to save the starving. And if that's true, then if the utilitarian consideration here holds, then it looks like we'd be obligated. It would be right for us to pursue those conceptions of the good life. Okay, so that captures a kind of more and more of a detail in Narveson's thinking about the issue of famine relief. Here's another one that's interesting. In stark contrast to the liberty-respecting view stands the idea that we are to count the satisfactions of others as equal to our own. If I can create a little more pleasure for some stranger by spending my dollar on him that I would create for myself spending it on an ice cream cone, I then have a putative obligation to spend it on him. Thus I am to continually defer to others in the organization of my activities, and shall be assailed by guilt whenever I am not bending my energies to the relief of those allegedly less fortunate than I. Benefit others at the expense of yourself, and keep doing it until you are as poor and miserable as those whose poverty and misery you are supposed to be relieving. That is the ethics of the Herrscher. Okay, so what's going on in this passage? Well, what he's trying to say is trying to have us think about cases like if we're really to take very seriously the idea that we have an obligation to help those who are absolutely impoverished or those who are in need, because our helping those who are in need is somehow preventing bad things from happening without sacrificing anything of comparable significance, according to, say, principles that Singer would adopt. Well, in those kinds of cases, then we're constantly going to have to be on the lookout for how it is that we can promote other people's goods, even at the neglect of promoting our own goods. And what that's going to be leading to is, as the very end of this passage suggests, an ethics of the hair shirt. Now, what does that mean? Ethics of the hair shirt. Think about a hair shirt. A hair shirt is a shirt that was worn by those who are repenting. So it's a religious activity, typically taking place in past times, where people who felt like they had done wrong wanted to repent for their wrongdoing, and they would wear these very uncomfortable shirts that were made out of animal hair that were very coarse and would be very uncomfortable to live in. And so people who were trying to repent would wear these shirts, and so they're very uncomfortable all the time. Here's Narveson's point here. The ethics that a Peter Singer would want to endorse, or an ethics that said that we have this very, very strict obligation to help those who are in need, including with respect to famine relief, is one that's going to make us, just given human nature, very, very uncomfortable, such that we're always going to have to be walking around living uncomfortably, thinking how it is that we can deny and suppress our desires and satisfactions for the sake of promoting someone else's, or at least for the sake of offsetting the pains or bads that other people are going to be experiencing were we not to step in to help them. So that's the ethics of the hair shirt that Narveson has us think about. Now, the last passage I want to just check out really quickly goes like this. In particular, it's not reasonable to become a busybody or a fanatic like Dickens's character, Mrs. Jellyby, who was so busy with her charitable work for the natives in the darkest of Africa that her own children run around in rags and become the terror of our neighborhood. Nor is it reasonable to be so concerned for the welfare of distant persons that you resort to armed robbery in your efforts to help them out. Stick them up. I'm collecting for Oxfam. So here, Narveson's having a little bit of fun, and he's just trying to say in this passage that when it comes to famine relief, we can't be so absorbed in trying to help those who are living in distant lands that we forget about those who are in need in our own communities, and in particular in our own families, those who are near to us, which kind of captures this intuitive idea that we kind of have a special obligation to care for those who are near us and make sure that their well-being is satisfied. And if we're so concerned with helping those who are absolutely impoverished overseas and elsewhere, we may neglect those who are near us and who really need our help. All right, so that captures Narveson's view of famine relief. is starkly different from that of Peter Singer. I hope you enjoyed watching. Thanks. Bye-bye.